Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the archaic Greeks, right? And we're actually going to be possibly ending most of the archaic period during this flip, which is going to be wild. And we're going to cover a bunch of stuff. You're going to write a bunch of stuff down. It's going to be great. You're going to do great on your test. You're going to crush it. And then I'm never going to have to worry about the honors classes ever because y'all have been awesome so far. Both of y'all have been awesome so far. Both classes. There are no favorites. Stop this lies and slander. Now, going on, though, into it, okay, let's go ahead and pick up right where we left off in class. We were talking about the Spartan government, right? Talking a lot about their culture. We talked about the Messenian War and how they practice a form of enslavement following warfare to try and do it so they could basically farm, create, and have an industry sector or an economy or basic things and stuff like that, while the rest of their men went off and were training for the military, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is we left off talking about also how their government is intrinsically very different from that of Athens, right? Sparta had 2 kings and a council of E4s, and Sparta's entire city setup was only about like 4 small villages and stuff like that, and each of those had a council of E4s as well. And so basically it was just kind of an oligarchy is what it's referred to as, right? An oligarchy is a small group of people that are in charge, right? Just a small ruling class. And also we do know that Spartans may have actually used voting even before Athens, except their voting was a very rudimentary form of yelling. Right? So like literally it's just walk into a room and be like, should we attack Athens? And if the volume was louder for yes or no, that was their form of voting. Now, going into it, though, we do also know that Sparta was just very much obsessed with war, right? And then we're talking about from the womb to the tomb, obsessed with war. Look how adorable that is. It's so funny. Now, so going into it, though, you have to understand that their obsession with war started even from birth, right? Like their entire dynamic of their culture is focused around waging war and training warriors and soldiers to prepare for war, and that includes men and also the culture of women that surrounds Sparta as well. Now, going into it, though, you have to understand that it was such an importance to Sparta to actually train people for war that they literally inspected newborns for any defects or impairments, right? Mr. Watterson was being really mean to me the other day and bullying me. I should probably actually fill out that bullying form and stuff like that and say, because what he did is he said, did you tell the kids that if you were a Spartan newborn, you would have been thrown in the woods? And which is really mean because he actually meant that. And what he was basically getting at is that all newborns in Sparta were inspected for any kind of defects or impairments. If they were underweight or small of size and things like that, literally they would leave the child in the woods. Like the person, if you had just given birth to a child and then literally a government inspector showed up at your door, inspected the newborn, and if it wasn't up to snuff, they just leave it for the wolves to eat, which is insane because to them they were like, oh, if this child has any type of defect, they will not grow up strong. If they don't grow up strong, they can't be a warrior. If they're not a warrior, they will be no use to us, right? At 7 years old, also, all boys left home to begin military training. Not 14, not 16, not 18, 7. So at 7, boys were forced to move out of their parents' homes and they would never live there again for the rest of their lives. And they were then inducted into military training where they were literally put through a very extreme, rigorous coursework. The very first day they got there, they were separated into little squadrons and battalions, and the largest child was elected as their leader. The very first thing you had to do was strip down all of your clothes and then make your own bed, because literally Spartan boys trained in the nude to try and actually buffer them for later fights, because the thing about it is if you are fighting with live swords and have no armor on, right? Literally, you'll learn to dodge a blade very efficiently. And then if you have armor on and a layer of protection, you'll be not only swift and cunning, but also you'll have a little bit of protection versus what you trained in your whole life, right? But yeah, they had to make their own bed the first day. It was an extremely rigorous thing where bullying was encouraged, right? Literally, Sparta encouraged its boys to bully one another, just like Mr. Watterson bullied me. He must be a true Spartan warrior. Now, the big thing about it, though, is they also, ladies, would bring y'all in, all right? Speaking of bullying, they would bring women in, okay, or girls about y'all's age from the surrounding towns and stuff like that, or from the surrounding villages where the boys were being trained in their military training, and they would bring y'all into the fields and literally have y'all point and laugh at the boys to try and build up their gumption and apparently make them stronger. Now, also, their training was extremely intense. Their diet was very, very rigorous as well. They were literally only given one thing to eat typically, and it was a type of blood soup where goat's blood and a bone and vinegar was boiled together with a little bit of wheat or some type of binder, which is absolutely disgusting. It's like blood porridge, right? They were given that, but then the officers, on the other hand, were not given that. They actually were given meat and vegetables and hearty meals and stuff like that. The men that were training them. So these guys over here, these older gentlemen, the officers, were given real food to eat, right? But they encouraged the boys to steal from them. Because the thing about it is, if you stole and got away with it, that means you were slick, sneaky, cunning, and crafty, right? But if you stole and got caught, they'd beat you mercilessly in front of the entire squadron, right? Which was ridiculous. But legitimately, they would actually encourage you to try and steal to see if you could get away with it, right? Now, also, just to give you a heads up, did they live in this barracks and eat blood soup and steal and then bully each other for their entire lives? No. Excuse me. At 20, they were allowed to get married. Now, interesting little factor here. Men in Athens were oftentimes marrying women that were a 40-year-old man to a 14-year-old girl, right? In Sparta, this is a little bit different, right? 20-year-old boys were getting married to girls around 16, right? So they were actually much closer in age, right? They could get married at age 20, but you couldn't live with your wife until you were 30 years old, right? You had to keep staying every night in the military barracks to create a situation of the wife understanding that you won't be there all the time, right? Now, going into it, those Spartan women also are much stronger and have way more rights than the Athenian women do, right? The very famous philosopher by the name of Aristotle has a very famous quote where he said that Spartan women rule their men, which is not really the case at all. He just felt that way because he was an Athenian and he thought that Spartan women had too many rights, if that shows you how much rights they had going forward. Spartan women received an education and had far more rights than Athenian women. For example, this is a very famous sculpture of an exercising Spartan woman, right? So Spartan women were expected to run the household because their husbands were typically away at war, right? And also on top of that, they were required to meet together every single morning and exercise because they were strong female bodies create strong offspring, right? And so literally even women had training courses of their own, right? Now going into it also, they ran the home, they married men their age, right? Which is also very awesome. There was a courting process. In Sparta, your parents would get y'all together and be like, do y'all like each other? And y'all got to date before you were forced, or not forced to marry, but you got to choose to marry one another, which is a very interesting thing. Now, the setup was, of course, through your parents and stuff like that. You didn't have a lot of leverage to say no. But the thing about it, though, is at least it was a courting process and stuff like that. Now, also an interesting thing as well, though, is that, I'm commenting on Spartan women and their rights, Spartan women owned 30% of all land in Sparta, which is wild, right? Because literally, if their husbands died during war, they were the ones that got to inherit the land. And they could divorce if they were being mistreated, right? It's a really amazing thing to actually look at Spartan culture and really diagram the position of women inside of it, because it just shows you how, yes, they were obsessed with war, but somehow this also created more rights for women in their society. Yes, they were obsessed with striking fear into the hearts of the enslaved, but they also gave more rights to women. You see what I'm saying? It's kind of like a both-and situation, right? Women also, for example, well, excuse me, let me back it up. The only two people to demonstrate Sparta's obsession with war that received tombstones when they died are men who died in battle, right? If you died in battle, you would actually be carried home on your shield, right? The most important part of your entire military gear. If I died in battle, literally Mr. Mathern and Mr. Wooderson and Mr. Capel and Mr. Roddy would lift me up on their shoulders on my shield, laying on it, and they would walk you back home, right? And you got a tombstone because you died in an honorable fashion. And women also got tombstones if they died during childbirth, which was considered basically, in essence, their war and battle in and of itself, right? So literally, it's a very interesting concept when you think about it, because these kind of cultural things within a few hundred years are going to lead to Sparta taking over most of Peloponnese, right? They're going to take over most of Peloponnese and later on even start a military league and a military, a military alliance known as the Peloponnesian League that'll actually help lead to the start of the Peloponnesian War, right? Now, speaking of wars, though, now we're going to kind of segue into something very, very new and different, right? We're talking about the Persian Wars, right? I need a big title for this in your notes, real big honker of a title, so you can actually just see where this stuff starts, because this is something that kids oftentimes forget and don't quite understand, and then also just aren't as interested in it as me, because I don't know, trying to explain war and stuff like that to high school girls in my personal experience at Chappelle has always kind of gone a little flat, but it's okay because I love talking about this stuff, right? But we're talking about the Persian Wars, right? Now, the Persian Wars are actually very important when you're talking about the progression of the Archaic period, right? Because when you look at the Persian Wars in the First Olympics, they mark the beginning and end of the Archaic period, right? So the Archaic period that we were talking about now, that's our third from the last time period that we have to talk about in Greece, is about to come to a close, right? The very first Olympics begins it in the 700s AD, or excuse me, 700s BC, the 700s BC, and the Persian Wars in the 400s BC actually see its end, right? And so now going into it, understanding it, the Persian Wars were a massive series of wars, though, okay? There were a series of 3 different wars, if you ask some people. But ironically enough, they really kind of aren't, because wars in the modern sense are like, hey, I'm going to attack you. You know I'm coming. You're going to attack me. Whoever wins gets this stuff that we settle it in a treaty, right? It's very interesting because if you want an outline of the wars themselves, the Persian wars, you could argue are not wars at all, right? You could argue they're not wars, but they kind of still are. The outline of it is it's one revolt, write this down, one revolt and two invasions, right? Okay? There was one revolt that outlines the first Persian War, where literally we'll talk about it in a few minutes. But the thing about it is like that one revolt is the first chapter in these Persian War story, and then there's two invasions by the Persians onto the Greeks, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is it's very interesting because the Greeks had to set aside their rivalries and actually come together to repel the Persians and eventually win these wars, right? Now, winning a war will then send you into the classical period because winning a war always tends to make you a lot of money, right? Now, like going into it, though, even though they don't like each other, even though Spartans refuse to make allies, even though they hate the Athenians with a scourge and fury, they still allied with them to deflect the Persians. But really quickly, though, some of you are like, Mr. J, who the heck's Persia? All right, so, and that is a great question, Ava. That is a great question, right? I think there's an Ava. There's an Ava, right? Isn't there an Ava? No? Yeah? Maybe? Yeah? I think so. All right, now, like, so going into it, though, who the heck is Persia? All right, it's a great question. All right, now going into it, you have to understand, Persia is a very, very large Eastern empire that's right next door to Greece and ancient Greece in general, okay? So when we're looking at this, you have to understand that they are massive, right? So like when we're talking about Persia, okay, this is Persia, right? They are very, very large and encompass all this different area, including northern Egypt at the time, the Persian Empire around 490, right before the beginning of the Persian invasions, right? And this is Greece right here, okay? That's Greece. There's Crete right there, right? Here's Greece. That's Persia, right? Like Persia is massive, right? They're absolutely huge, okay? Now, first off, we got to outline these whole things, right? Like I said, there are one revolt and two invasions in all of these wars, but the major cause, though, is, as we can tell from this map over here to the right, is that Persia wants to keep expanding, right? Like Persia wants to keep getting larger. No empire is ever just looking at their borders and being like, you know what? I'm satisfied. I like it. It looks good. I think we're as big as we need to be. Ask the Romans, right? Ask the Hellenistic Greeks, right? Ask anybody. Ask Alexander the Great himself. No empire is ever big enough. So the Persians want to keep expanding, right? And they expanded originally out of what is modern-day Iran, right? And this area known as Persepolis, okay, is their capital city. But as you can see, they literally emanated out. This is where the Persians are from, and they managed to conquer everything over here all the way to northern India, including modern-day Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and even some southern parts of Kazakhstan, and then going all the stands, a bunch of the stands right over here. And then going also all the way over here as well into what is now modern-day Turkey and into northern Egypt, right? But now we got somebody in our sights. We got the Greeks, right? Because going further into India would have been really difficult because the Himalaya mountains kind of stand in your way. So like now, so it's much easier for them to go west, right? And they wanted to take over the Greeks next, right? Now, the interesting thing about it, though, is that the very, very first Persian War, right? The very first Persian War actually is a revolt, right? And it doesn't really involve the Greeks as much as you might think. And it's known as the Ionian Revolt that broke out in 499 BC, all right? Now, there's a little bit of a historical bias here, all right? Now, what I mean by that is, when we look at things, typically in films, movies, cultural documents, texts, right? And when we look at the history of the Persian Wars by Greek historians, particularly Polybius, I think is one of the ones that actually wrote down all this Persian War stuff. When we look at all this, they paint the Persians as the invading scourge, right? As these people that came in and took over everything and that they were bad and mean and evil and stuff like that. And they're always painted as the bad guy, whereas the Greeks are always painted as the good guys, right? For example, in the film 300 that we'll talk about several times throughout this class, the Persians are the bad guy, right? And the protagonists are the Greeks, right? But the cause of this whole thing, though, is that Persia did take over something. It was an area known as Anatolia, right? When we're talking about Anatolia, we mean this area of Western Turkey right here, okay? Now, in Anatolia, right, there are Greeks that live there, right? Because don't forget about Greek colonization, all right? So when we go all the way back to the Archaic period, we know very, very well that the Greeks did colonize stuff, right? They didn't stay in their one little area. They sent emissaries and people out to colonize different areas of the world, including as far over as Sicily, which is right next to, right underneath modern-day Italy, right? So when we're looking at this entire thing, one of those colonies is right over here. It's an area known as Ionia, right? You see that right there? Ionia, right? That had some Greeks inside of it, okay? Now, the irony of this entire situation is Greeks didn't belong there really in the first place, and they colonized that whole area and took it first, and then they got a little salty whenever the Persians took it over. But the other big irony is that living under Persian rule actually wasn't bad, right? Like, if the Persians took over your area, all they did was they said, hey, look, you got a religion, Keep it. We don't care. Knock yourself out. You don't have to worship what we worship. It doesn't matter. We're Zoroastrian. You can love your polytheistic. You can believe in those mountain gods. You can do all that stuff. Do what you want, right? Keep your customs. Keep your language. Keep everything you do. All you have to do is swear allegiance to the Persian Empire and pay us a tax. And that's it. And just promise you won't revolt or anything like that. So the ironic part about this is that Ionia probably would have been better off and happier if they would have stayed under Persian rule. But they didn't want to do that. And they managed to make somebody very upset, right? Now, and that guy is going to be known as Darius the First, who was the king of Persia at the time, right? At the time, whenever Ionia was taken over, Darius was their leader, right? And as the king of Persia, fun fact also, he wasn't supposed to be. He actually killed a bodyguard, or like he was the bodyguard of Cyrus the Great, but then he killed a guy that was pretending to be his son. It's like a whole story. Now, going into it, though, the Ionians are going to hold a very large revolt against him, right? And Darius is like, what the heck? You know what I mean? Like, I'll let you keep your religion. I'll let you keep your customs. I'll let you keep all that stuff. And all you had to do was just do what I asked you to do. But the Ionians start freaking out. They start burning their fields and burning Persian vessels and start attacking the Persian like satraps and also as well as like no, not satraps. They started attacking the Persian governors that lived there and stuff like that. And they hold this big revolt. And then Darius is forced to send a very large army to nope, too far. There we go. All right, so Darius is forced to send an army to go and quell and stop that revolt, right? And so when he does do this, there we go, he finds out, though, that the Ionians have weapons, right? And the Ionians have swords and ships, and they have some shields and armor and stuff. Turns out that it was the Athenians that sent them that stuff, right? So this is going to make Darius a little bit upset, right? Darius sends troops and armies over a few years and crushes the rebellion, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is that he's going to be pretty mad, right? Because literally, he's reminded all the time that the Athenians meddled in his affairs, right? Like, now he's upset about this because the Ionians only were able to stage a revolt because the Athenians that live all the way over here, right? Like, Athens is right there, right? Sent stuff to the people under his rulership, right? He was like, how dare you do that? And also, a servant that he had, a butler, reminded him every day of this, apparently. According to myth and legend, every single day when Darius was there sitting there just eating his food and stuff like that, this butler would lean over and whisper into his ear, "Master, remember the Athenians." It's like that one friend that never lets you forget that you have a grudge against somebody that used to be in your lunch group. It's like that, right? So Darius is going to be pretty upset about this entire thing, right? And so literally the first Persian invasion will take place because of this being upset, right? Do me a favor, right? Because you have your cause right here. It says ... wants revenge, okay? Like, so very important that you keep that. Give me one line underneath that as well in your notes, right? It's going to say cause ... wants revenge. Some of y'all love to keep your notes all scrunched up and stuff like that. Talking to you, Madison, right? Talking to you, Clea as well. All right, so now look, big thing about it though, all right? Leave like one little line underneath that cause, right? Because we're going to get into it a little bit more in class and discuss a little bit more heavily what that cause really was, right? But a big one is that Darius wants revenge. He's mad at the Athenians, right? He's really upset that they did this to him and stuff like that, that they gave the land, that they gave weapons and armor and stuff to the Ionians, right? And so Darius launches a huge land invasion, right? He assembles a very massive Persian army because the Persian army is the biggest army that has ever existed in the world up until this point, right? And so he decides that he's going to attack some people, right? And so he launches a huge invasion. Now, there is several battles that happen during this invasion, but there is one defining one delta moment in all of these other battles, though, that makes it all, is like the make or break of this entire invasion. And it's known is the Battle of Marathon, right? Now, the Battle of Marathon took place in 490 BC and kind of closed the door shut on how this whole thing was going to work, right? And at the Battle of Marathon, the Athenians will be the ones that win the day, right? And they were drastically outnumbered by the Persians, right? They were outnumbered 2.5 to 1, which means that there were 2.5, not like a pair of legs running around with a sword. That would be weird. But there were 2.5 equal, mathematically, there were 2.5 Persian soldiers to every one Athenian, right? And that's really bad odds, right? That means you're almost outnumbered 3 to 1, right? Which is a very, very bad thing. Because, think about it. Like, if you got Victoria McCann, who's about to fight some kids, right? 3 is a pretty hard thing to beat up, right? Victoria, I think you could take a few kids, right? You know what I'm talking about? Like, if Callie and Allie attacked you, I think you could take them. But is there a half child in that class? If Emma Pillow comes at you from behind, though, you might be a little bit nervous about it, right? The thing about it, though, is that they're going to use superior tactics, much like Victoria McCann would, of course, use, to actually win the day, right? And what they do is they actually set set their troops up in a very specific location, right? So the Persians actually had to land their troops on a beach, right? And these are all the Persian ships right here, okay? So if I zoom in a little bit right here, the Persians landed their fleet right there, put their encampment right there, but the Greeks showed up here. The Athenians arrived on a higher elevated area of land above the beach where the Persians were set up, right? They threatened them and taunted them into a fight, right? So now as we can see right here, okay, there are a lot more Persian lines than there are Greek ones, right? But what they did, though, is they wanted to goad the Persians into a center formation. So they literally rushed down the hill, attacked the middle of their formation, causing their cavalry to come in on the sides and for their group to bunch up in the middle. And what they ended up happening, though, is they then circled the Persians, right? Encircled them completely and used their phalanx systems, okay, to attack them from every single edge and drive them back, right? Now, the Battle of Marathon was a huge deal because the Athenians were not supposed to win. They should have lost, right? By the numbers, they definitely should have lost, right? But then there was this guy, right? There's this famous moment, like after the Battle of Marathon, because the Athenians were like, oh my God, this is so crazy. We should not have won that. Blah! And they find a runner, right? A messenger, right? And his name is Phidippides, right? And they look at Phidippides and they're like, hey, Phidippides, we need you to do us a favor. We need you to run to Athens as fast as you can, get down there, and tell them that we won. Right, so Phidippides, tell him we won, right? And Phidippides apparently then ran the 26.2 miles from the field of Marathon to Athens, Greece, right? And then he went to the Council of Archons in his full uniform. He also did it dogs out, too, barefoot, which is crazy if this actually happened, right? He rolls up to him and he goes, rejoice, we have conquered Nike, and he dies, right? Apparently, Phidippides died after running 26.2 miles, which is another emphasis where it's like, tell your gym teacher next time and be like, the last person that ran really far died, so I don't think we should do it anymore. Now, the thing about it, though, is Phidippides, though, is a very famous figure in this entire thing, who apparently was the runner that carried that message. And it's why a marathon race is called a marathon, right? Because it's in honor of Phidippides and his run back to Athens, right? Because it's 26.2 miles. Take that. So the big thing about it, though, also, it used to also be a running store, right? Down the street, like right near Tyzap and over there in the shopping center that's got like next to the Office Depot or whatever, there used to be a store called Phidippides Running Store, right? Which actually had some Phidippides on the sides of it, which is super, super cool. Now, really quick, though, question is, where was Sparta during this whole thing? Well, they didn't fight the Persians. They were like, I don't want to get involved, right? They actually, ironically, were not inside of this. They were actually dealing with some other stuff back home, but they did not actually fight in this early Persian invasion, right? Now, the thing about it, though, okay, then you have the biggest results from this, all right? Athens, feeling good about themselves, right? Was not supposed to win that war, and they want to create an alliance, and Sparta's not a fan, right? Because Athens is afraid that they might come back again. Now, Darius is getting older by this point. If he's going to invade, he'll probably die before he ever invades again, right? But Athens wants to create an alliance to defend from future Persian invasion, right? They also want to build up a massive navy because they noticed in this whole thing that that's the thing the Persians have that we don't, right? They were like, if we ever got goaded out into the water, they'll destroy us, right? Because the Persians had a very large naval fleet and the Greeks did not really have much of one at all, right? And so they began to build up a massive navy because they wanted to corner the market in destroying people in the water, right? And the boats that they built are very important, and you need to write down what they're called. Okay, what are they called? They're called triremes, right? The boats that the Athenians began to build up a very large number of were called triremes, right? Trireme, right? Trireme, right? Trireme. And they are called this due to the fact that they have apparently 3 rows of oars on the sides of them. Now, the thing about it when you're looking at these big goofy things, right, that have eyeballs painted on the front of them because the Athenians wanted to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies by making it look like a sea monster was coming at them. How does that boat, though, sink another boat, right? Well, some of you are probably like, bows and arrows, grappling hooks, pirates. No. So, the way they actually do it, though, is using these, right? This thing right here on the front, it's got a bronze battering ram on it, right? And you'll notice in the water, you can't really see it very well. So the goal was literally to row the boat into an enemy vessel, and that battering ram would pop a hole in the base of a Persian vessel and sink it if it needed to, right? That's a bronze battering ram from a trireme that has actually been discovered on the base of the Mediterranean before, right? Now, why didn't Darius come back? It's because he died, right? When he actually retreated back and he was preparing for another invasion, he does end up dying, right? But that leads to the rise of his son, a man by the name of Xerxes, right? Xerxes, Xerxes, right? The first, who comes in 484 BC, who movies want to tell you he looks like this, all right? But in real life, he actually looked like this. All right, so so just to give you a heads up. But we'll talk more about that stuff when I see y'all in class. Y'all have a good one.